A woman spent 18 months living as a man. She cut her hair, trained her voice, had fake stubble applied every morning, changed how she walked, picked a name, Ned, and went in. Bowling leagues, monasteries, sales jobs, dating bars, 6 different male worlds, 18 months, complete immersion. At the end of it, she checked herself into a psychiatric facility. Not because anyone found her out, not because something was done to her, because of what she felt from the inside and couldn't stop feeling. She went in expecting to find privilege. She came out saying, "Men are suffering. They have different problems than women have, but they don't have it better." Now here's the part nobody talks about. She broke after 18 months. Not from the danger of it, not from the deception, from the weight of performing competence every single day. From an equation that said your value equals what you produce and never once said you'd done enough. From living inside a system that has no mechanism for asking whether any of it is working. 18 months broke her. You've been running the same system for 30 years. And here's what that means, because this is the thing nobody will say to you directly. The reason the standard fixes don't work isn't that you lack discipline or motivation or the right mindset, it's that you've been applying execution solutions to an architecture problem, and those are completely different things. That's what this is about. Not the weight, you already know the weight, the architecture underneath it. Why it stays invisible, and what actually changes it. Let's stay with Vincent for a minute, because what she found is important, and most people who've heard about this experiment only know the headline. The headline is, "Woman disguises herself as man, has breakdown, checks into psychiatric facility." That's the story most people walk away with. It frames the whole thing as a cautionary tale about deception, about the psychological cost of maintaining a false identity for 18 months. That framing misses the actual finding. Yes, Vincent attributed part of her breakdown to what she called the burden of deception, the psychological cost of maintaining 2 identities simultaneously, of deceiving people who trusted Ned, of holding Norah and Ned in the same body for a year and a half. But that's not all that happened. That's not what she wrote about with the most weight. What she wrote about, what she came back to again and again, was the feeling of what it was like to be inside the male experience, not to observe it, to feel it from the inside. Here's what she found. The men she embedded with were not emotionally shallow. That was her first assumption going in, and it was wrong. The guys in the bowling league would do anything for each other. Real loyalty, show up at 3 a.m. loyalty, no questions asked loyalty. The monks had interior lives that surprised her with their depth. The men in the support group were carrying pain that had been accumulating for decades. The system wasn't emotionally empty, it was emotionally indirect. Men connect through doing, through showing up, through banter that means more than it sounds like, through a decade of Tuesday nights at the same bowling alley that never once included a direct conversation about how anyone was actually doing. The connections were real. The architecture for maintaining them when something went genuinely wrong, when the Tuesday nights ended, when someone moved or got divorced or lost a job or got sick, that architecture didn't exist. There was no language for it. There was no channel. And then there was the provider equation. Among the working-class men Vincent embedded with, she found something she described as a crushing, unspoken math. Your value as a man equals what you earn, what you fix, what you build, what you provide. It was not a settled calculation. It had to be rerun every day. There was no finish line. There was no point at which you had done enough and could simply be a person. The equation doesn't produce satisfaction. It produces the next requirement. If you have ever achieved something genuinely significant, a promotion, a financial goal, a project you're proud of, and found that the feeling lasted about 3 days before the weight of the next thing took over, that is not ingratitude. That is not a failure to be present. That is the equation running exactly as designed. The equation was never built to produce satisfaction. It was built to produce continued performance. Vincent also wrote about emotional range. She described male emotional expression as operating on about 3 notes: bravado and rage, with not much space between them. Not because men feel less, because the system has fewer channels. Women, she wrote, get octaves, and when the only tools you have are the 3-note range, and something happens that requires a completely different register, grief, real fear, confusion, love that isn't performing anything, there's no language for it. There's no one trained to receive it, even if you found the language. She experienced this for 18 months. It hospitalized her. Here's what's worth sitting with. The weight didn't break her because she was weak. It broke her because she felt it consciously from the outside, as something new and foreign and relentless. You adapted to the same weight, which means you stopped experiencing it as weight. You started experiencing it as normal, as just how things are. That's not strength. That's what adaptation looks like. And the problem with adaptation is this: when something stops working, when the performance starts costing more than it's returning, when the equation stops producing even the temporary feeling of being enough, when the Tuesday nights are gone and the architecture underneath them never existed, you have no way to diagnose it because the system you're running doesn't have a diagnostic tool. It only has one instruction: keep going. That's where most men over 40 are. Not broken, not lazy, not intelligent, running software that was built for a version of their life they're no longer living, with no mechanism to notice that the software is the problem. Terrence Real spent 20 years as a therapist, working almost exclusively with men and their families. His central finding is one of those things that sounds obvious once you hear it and was almost entirely absent from clinical practice for decades. Men's depression doesn't look like depression. Most people carry a mental image of what depression looks like: the inability to get out of bed, the flatness, the withdrawal. That picture isn't wrong, but it's describing one specific form. Real calls it overt depression: acute, dramatic, visible. Covert depression looks like the opposite. It looks like hyperfunction. It looks like a man who is perpetually busy, perpetually achieving, perpetually productive. It looks like someone who has no time to slow down because the moment they slow down, something comes up from underneath that they don't have a name for and don't want to feel. It looks like irritability that never quite becomes anger because the anger would require acknowledging something is wrong. It looks like emotional flatness inside a life that, from the outside, looks fine. Real's phrase for what's underneath: a man running from his own pain, desperately, and using achievement, busyness, control, and work as the fuel for the running. He writes, "If overtly depressed men are paralyzed, men who are covertly depressed cannot stand still. They run, desperately trying to outdistance shame by medicating their pain, pumping up their tenuous self-esteem, or, if all else fails, inflicting their torture on others." The problems we associate with men, workaholism, emotional unavailability, the inability to be present at home, the drinking, the affairs, the chronic low-grade irritability. Real's argument is that these are not character failures. They are symptoms. They are what covert depression looks like when it's running a management strategy. You are not broken. You are running an extremely effective but extraordinarily expensive workaround for pain you were never given tools to process. Here's the part that lands hardest for men over 40 specifically. Real argues that the men most at risk of hitting this wall, really hitting it, not just feeling worn down, but genuinely losing the thread, are not the men who failed. They are the men who succeeded. The men who executed the operating system flawlessly. The men who provided, who showed up, who kept the mask on through every hard stretch, every disappointment, every year when nothing quite went the way they'd planned, but they kept the external machinery running anyway. These men built a life, a real one by every measurable standard, and they built it entirely on the outside, on performance, on production, on what could be pointed to and verified. What they didn't build, what they were never taught to build, and were in some cases actively discouraged from building, was anything on the inside, any relationship where they didn't have to have it together, any sense of identity that wasn't attached to a role, any internal architecture at all. So one day the kids leave, or the career plateaus, or the body starts making demands the mind used to be able to ignore, and there is nothing underneath the performance to stand on. The performance was the floor. Take it away, and there's nothing below it. Reel also found something in his clinical work that connects directly back to what Vincent observed from the outside. By the time men in their 40s and 50s reach a genuine crisis point, they have typically reduced their entire emotional world to one relationship, usually a partner, sometimes a single close friend. That one relationship is carrying a weight it was never designed to carry because every other channel closed down somewhere in the last 2 decades of building the life. And when that relationship is strained or absent, the man has essentially no support infrastructure at all. Not because he doesn't want one, because he never built it, because the operating system didn't include it as a requirement. This is not a moral failure. This is what happens when you spend 30 years executing an excellent plan for someone else's life, the life a 24-year-old drew up, and forget to build a self inside it. Now, here's where Reel's framework and Vincent's observation converge on something important. Vincent described the male emotional system as having 3 notes. Reel describes it as a cultural training process that runs from boyhood. Boys learn through thousands of small, ordinary moments that the expressivity their mothers and sisters model is to be suppressed, devalued, traded in for the stoicism their fathers model. Not through dramatic lessons, through cumulative small signals, through the look on a father's face, through what gets praised and what gets ignored, through being called soft or told to toughen up in moments that didn't require toughening up. None of this is a deliberate conspiracy. It's an architecture that gets transmitted because it was transmitted to the people who transmitted it to you. Your father didn't teach you to disconnect. He modeled the only system he knew, the system that was modeled for him. The result is a man who by his 40s has a highly developed capacity for performing competence and a very limited capacity for doing anything else. Not because he chose that, because that's what the architecture built. And here's what makes it almost impossible to see from the inside. The architecture is working. The performance is functional. The covert depression looks like high function. The running looks like productivity. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, which means there's no obvious moment where you can point at it and say, this is wrong, this is the thing. It just produces, over time, the feeling that something is missing, that the life you built doesn't quite fit, that you've been doing the right things for a very long time and still can't shake the sense that something important isn't there. That feeling is not a sign that you're ungrateful or that you don't appreciate what you have or that you need to find your purpose in some motivational sense. That feeling is diagnostic information. It's the system trying to tell you what it can't say directly. Johann Hari spent years researching why depression and anxiety have been rising steadily across the Western world despite the fact that we have more access to treatment, more awareness, and more antidepressants than at any point in history. His conclusion, built from years of interviews with leading researchers documented in Lost Connections, was that we have been treating the wrong thing. Not because the treatments are ineffective at what they do, but because we've been addressing symptoms while missing causes. His core argument, the epidemic of chronic low-grade suffering that most people attribute to brain chemistry, is primarily driven by disconnection. Disconnection from meaningful work, disconnection from other people, disconnection from a future you can actually see yourself in. This isn't a theory about clinical depression specifically, it's a framework for the kind of low-grade flatness, the persistent sense that something is off, the chronic mild stuckness that millions of men over 40 live with and simply call how it is now. The thing you've stopped fighting because fighting it never seemed to produce any lasting result. Hari's research points to 3 disconnections that are doing the most damage for this specific audience. Not 3 separate problems, one problem with 3 faces. The first is disconnection from meaningful work. This is not the same as job dissatisfaction. Most men over 40 have optimized their careers to produce good outcomes. The question Hari is asking is different. Is what you're doing with your days connected to anything you actually care about? Or are you still running the provider equation on autopilot, doing what was necessary at 30 because it's what you know how to do, and because stopping would require a conversation with yourself you don't know how to have? The research Hari cites is consistent. The strongest predictor of whether work produces psychological well-being is not income or status or even interest level, it's agency. The sense that what you do matters, that you have some ownership over how you do it, that you could point to the work and say, that reflects something about who I actually am. When work becomes purely transactional, when it's the mechanism that funds the life rather than a part of the life, it stops providing the psychological returns it once did. And for men who built their identity around what they do, that's not just a career problem, it's an identity problem. The role emptied out. The person inside the role has been waiting for a long time. The second disconnection is from other people. The data on this is not gentle. Over the last 30 years, male close friendships have contracted dramatically. In 1990, more than half of American men reported having 6 or more close friends. Today, that number is closer to 1 in 4. 15% of men now report having 0 close friends, a figure that was near 0 3 decades ago. When facing a personal crisis, only 22% of men say they would turn to a friend first, compared to nearly half in 1990. This didn't happen because men stopped caring about friendship. It happened because the architecture for maintaining it was never built into the life. And as the life got busier, as careers absorbed more energy, as families required more infrastructure, friendships became optional in a way that work and family never were. And optional things in a life without margin become absent things. The result is what Vincent observed in the bowling league and what Reel documents in his clinical work. Most men over 40 have surface relationships and one deep one, maybe 2. That's not enough infrastructure for a full life. It's especially not enough infrastructure for the moments when something goes genuinely wrong. Here's what makes this harder. The men who are most isolated rarely feel isolated in the acute way. They feel fine most of the time. They have plenty of interactions. They talk to people all day. But the interactions are transactional, work conversations, logistics with a partner, exchanges that don't go below a certain depth because there's no agreement that they should. What they don't have is anyone who actually knows what's going on with them, anyone who could answer the question, how is he, really? What's he actually dealing with right now? For most men over 40, that person either doesn't exist or exists only in the form of a partner who has been carrying that weight alone for years. The third disconnection is from a future you can actually see. Hari cites research showing that people experiencing chronic low-grade depression literally cannot visualize their future in concrete terms. Not that they're pessimistic about the future, that they can't picture it at all. The horizon goes flat. For men over 40 who have achieved most or all of their original goals, the career, the family, the house, the stability, this is often the silent driver of the stuckness. The original goals were achieved. Nobody told them what comes next. Nobody replaced the horizon. And a man without a horizon isn't depressed in the clinical sense, he's just running without direction, and eventually that starts to feel like running in place. Here's what Hari's framework makes clear that the others don't. None of these three disconnections respond to discipline. You cannot work your way into meaning. You cannot be disciplined into genuine connection. You cannot force your way to a sense of future. Discipline is a tool for execution. You can't execute your way out of not knowing what you're executing towards. The operating system you've been running, perform, produce, provide, repeat, is an execution system. It's excellent at getting things done. It has no mechanism for the questions that matter in your 40s and 50s. What am I actually connected to? Who actually knows me? What does the next part of this look like? Those aren't execution problems, they're architectural problems. And architectural problems require architectural solutions. What follows is not a mindset shift, not a resolution, not a commitment to be more vulnerable or more present or more intentional in some vague directional sense. Those are execution instructions for a problem that doesn't respond to execution. These are three structural changes, things to build, specific enough that you'll know whether you've built them. None of them require you to become a different person. None of them require a dramatic break from the life you have. They require building something alongside what already exists. Three pieces of infrastructure that the operating system never included, and that the operating system cannot produce no matter how well you run it. The first, one relationship with no performance requirement. Not therapy, though therapy is a reasonable tool if you want it. Not a vulnerability project, not a commitment to share more of yourself with people. One specific relationship where the unspoken agreement is, I don't have to have it together here. Vincent found that men in her bowling league were entirely capable of genuine connection. The capacity existed. What didn't exist was the architecture, the explicit or implicit agreement that this is a place where the performance can come down. Most male friendships are performance neutral, which means the performance never fully comes down. You can be around each other for years without the performance coming down. What you need is one relationship where it's explicitly different, where the other person knows enough about what's actually going on with you that if something went genuinely wrong, they would know. Not because you had a breakthrough conversation, because the relationship has been built that way, gradually, over time. This is not about finding a best friend or a confidant in some dramatic sense. It's about one person, one relationship, where the requirement to perform is off the table. You probably already know who that person could be. You've known for years. The question is whether you've made the structural decision to build the relationship that way, or whether you've been waiting for it to happen on its own, which is how relationships work in your 20s, not in your 40s. In your 40s, the relationships that matter get built on purpose. The ones that don't get built on purpose fade into logistics. The second, one activity that produces nothing. The provider equation, the mechanism Vincent observed, the one Reel documents as the architecture of covert depression, runs on a simple logic. Your value equals your output. Everything you do gets measured, consciously or not, against that equation. Your hobbies are productive. Your rest is recovery so you can produce again. Your relationships are maintained as infrastructure for the life. Everything feeds back into the equation. The second structural change is one activity in your life that is not subject to the equation. Something you do because it's worth doing on its own terms, not because of what it produces. This doesn't have to be significant in any external sense. It doesn't have to be something you're good at or that reflects well on you. In fact, those conditions make it harder to find because the equation immediately evaluates them. What you're looking for is something where the question, "What is this for?" has an honest answer. Nothing. It's just this. The reason this matters structurally, not psychologically, structurally, is that the provider equation has no off switch. It runs continuously. The only way to interrupt it is to do something the equation has no category for, something that doesn't produce a result to be evaluated, an activity that exists entirely outside the logic of return. This is harder to find than it sounds. Most men, when asked what they do for themselves, describe things that are steadily tied to output. Working out is health, which is production. Reading is learning, which is investment. Even most hobbies have a performance dimension attached. You're looking for something that genuinely doesn't. It doesn't matter what it is. What matters is that when you're doing it, the question of whether it's worth your time has a clean, honest answer. Yes, because I'm doing it. The third, one honest inventory. Not a life review, not a crisis, not a commitment to figure everything out. A single honest answer to a single question written down somewhere just for you. The question is, what would I be doing differently if I stopped performing? Not what do I want? That question is too big and too loaded. Not what's my purpose? That's the kind of question the operating system immediately turns into an execution project. What would I be doing differently, concretely, in my actual days, in my actual relationships, in the actual hours I have available? Hari's research suggests something important here. The act of naming the disconnection, putting language on the specific thing that's missing, not in a vague sense, but concretely, begins to shift the relationship to it. Not because naming something makes it go away, because naming it makes it real in a way that unnamed things aren't. And things you can't name, you can't address. The inventory isn't a plan. It isn't a commitment to change. It's a document, one page, one paragraph, even one sentence that says, "This is what I can see from here, honestly, about the gap between the life I'm performing and the life I'd be building if the performance were optional." Most men have never written that document, not because they haven't thought about it. They've thought about it plenty, usually at 2 a.m. or on long drives. But the thoughts stay in that form, circling without landing, because there's no structure to land them in. The inventory creates the structure. These three things, one relationship, one activity, one inventory, are not the solution to everything. They are the beginning of a different architecture, a second structure built alongside the first one that actually accounts for who you are now, not who you needed to be at 25. Norah Vincent came out of the experiment with something she hadn't gone in looking for. She went in to understand privilege. She came out with a respect for the weight men carry that she hadn't anticipated, and a grief that she described as almost unbearable, not for any specific man, but for the systemic invisibility of it. The way the suffering runs without acknowledgement, without a language, without anyone, including the men themselves, naming what it is. She said, men need each other more than anything else. Not women to fix them, not therapy to excavate them. Each other. The architecture of genuine connection that the operating system never built. Here's what Reel's 20 years of clinical work and Hari's research and Vincent's 18 months all point toward when you lay them on top of each other. The men who hit the wall in their 40s and 50s are not the ones who failed. They are the ones who succeeded at a version of themselves that was always too small to live in permanently. The provider, the fixer, the competent one, the man who keeps it together. Those are roles. Real is asking, who are you when the role is finished? Hari is asking, what are you connected to that isn't a function? Vincent is asking, what does the inside of this actually feel like if you slow down long enough to feel it? The fact that you're watching this video means you already know something isn't working. Not your intelligence, not your discipline, not your willingness to work, the architecture. The operating system you've been running since you were a teenager, perform, produce, provide, repeat, was designed for a different life than the one you're actually trying to build now. That system got you here. That's real. It built things that matter. It protected people who needed protecting. It produced a life that, by most external measures, looks like it's working. The question is not whether the system served you. The question is whether it still does. Whether the thing that got you here is the same thing that takes you where you want to go next. Whether the floor you built is solid enough to live on, or whether it only holds if you keep moving. The system can be rebuilt, not by replacing what you've built, by building something underneath it, the architecture that was always missing. Not with discipline, with structure. That's what this channel is for.